Welcome back to A Latte for You, Mixed Media Canvas by Gisette Trunnell, design team member for Flossy Scrapper in Burleson, Texas, or online at flossyscrapper.com. In part 2, we will continue. Everything is dried. I have fitted the whipped cream to the cup, and I had added a small amount of glue using Ranger Glossy Accents, and now I'm adding the final amount here, and then just will be tacking this down gently. The top has been left open. We'll be cutting a straw out of some green paper and inserting it in the top. On the final project, I also used a Starbucks lid that you can see here in the picture, and that will be glued on at a later time. But right now we're concentrating on getting everything laid down, the straw cut and applied to the canvas. Alright, so this video clip shows how I have managed to get the beans on. First, I used a stencil and traced the beans onto the bottom of the canvas. Then, I'm just checking here to make sure everything is glued down. Then I stamped on another piece of paper the beans by masking off everything but the beans, stamping it on twice, and then I cut it to fit just like I did with the whipped cream, and that has been adhered with the 3D glossy gel. The next thing I did was to begin using a marker to outline and start adding shading to these images. Now I'm using Pitt pens by Faber Castell. These are unique in that they are an Indian ink, and when initially placed down they are wet and movable, especially when placed over a medium, either gesso or gel. Once they dry, however, they are permanent. So this gives us an advantage of having a marker that is movable, blendable if you will, and dry permanently, so that in the end when I spray other medium or spray paint or even seal the canvas, I know that this paint will not react. So here I'm just going over the outline with a brown Pitt pen, and I'm just adding some shadow to the inside. I'm going to do the same thing over here on the coffee cup. And just basically trying to give it that three-dimensional look. Now I need to put the coffee in. I'm shading that on down, filling in the curve on the handle, and just shading it. This is very rough. If I make a mistake while it's still wet, I can use a wet cloth or baby wipe and remove the ink. And then once it dries, I can go back over with the same baby wipe and I will not be moving it. So now I'm going to fill in the coffee with a dark gray, almost black. Reinforcing these lines. And it's just a matter of laying it down and then going over and over until you get the depth and color and the three-dimensionality that you're after. Also, I need to mention that the 3D gel leaves the brush strokes, so that also helps with the shading as you blend it out, it kind of pulls into those brush strokes and helps give some 3-dimension to it. Here I'm going in with a darker brown now, reinforcing it a bit more, trying to get this cup to look like it's coming off of the paper. This can be a rather tedious exercise. You add a little, wipe a little, add a little, wait for it to dry. So I've moved on to the other cup, working on it. Working around the whipped cream. That piece of plastic you see laying there, I briefly mentioned that it was cut from a Starbucks cup and it will be glued on later. I just went to Starbucks, bought a drink, washed it up, and cut it up. Now I'm adding some gray around the outside to try to move that cup a bit further forward and the background to the back. And again, it's just layer upon layer. Light gray, medium gray, dark gray. There's no rhyme or reason to what works. You just have to go with your eye and blend as you go. I'm going to do the same for all of these images, including the beanbag. Now the beanbag has, on the stamp, had the word coffee, and I will show you later how I masked that out, but when you see it, it will have already been done because I needed to get all this to dry. I'm going around the straw. Now, these straws have little lines. The lines, I just used a scoring board and put some lines in and crunched it up, and I'll be using this pen to darken that line to give the sense of rippling. Adding more gray under that lid, and you can see how the cup is starting to move off of the paper. A little more shadow on that side to stimulate roundness across the bottom, the handle. I thought about cutting this video clip, but this is probably the one step that makes the project have that 3D, and so I felt it was worth having you see the entire process here. The beans will be colored with the same markers. That's what I'm starting to do now, just using a light and a dark marker, randomly coloring them in, and I will do the same thing on the bean bag. On the bean bag, I stamped the word coffee. The rest of it I freehand in using the coffee stamp as a reference. With the rumples in that canvas, getting a good stamp was difficult. So I just basically roughed it all in. In this clip, you see how everything has been shaded and is now finished. The coffee stamp was masked off and the word stamped on, and then it was enhanced with the Pitt markers. The bag was shaded exactly the same way as the cup, and the beans have all been colored in and shaded. Now I'm going to be taking a multi-liner pen. You can use a Sharpie or any permanent marker, and I'm just sketching around the outside And this is more just to give a little more definition. I'm not making solid lines, it's just kind of sketchy. And it just helps the eye identify this as an object separate from the background. I'm going around everything. The bags, I'm adding a few hairlines, reinforcing some of the darker areas with the stamp. The bag, just trying to replicate a folded over bag. Now, here we're going to add steam. I'm using a leaf-vined stencil. And this is a good example as to how to use something that may not be intended for steam, but it certainly looks like steam, and it will give us that illusion of steam. So I'm selecting which part of the stencil is going to give me the most steam-like look, and then using the Ranger texture paste, we'll be applying this to the canvas. So I'll be continuing adding the texture paste, filling in, choosing which parts of the stencil that I want, and then when I have finished it, the stencil will be removed, and anything that landed where I didn't want it will be removed, and we'll be left with what appears to be steam. So here we have this already. The steam has been applied, and now I'm going to begin working on the cup. I'm using a circle stamp. I'll be stamping that into the center of this cup, basically creating a band. The stamp had a band, but again, once we're at this point, it's very difficult to stamp over, and so I'm using a separate stamp and the India ink to repeat the same process. Now, the canvas does bow in the middle at times, and so I'm putting my hand underneath and giving some resistance and restamping. Then I'll be taking the India ink pen and drawing in the line. And here again, I use the Archival ink. Be redrawing those lines, and then we'll begin outlining and shading just like we did in previous shading parts. And in this instance, this first line will not hold. I'm going to have to come back and reinforce it as I'm coloring over, and I'll be reinforcing the center of the line as well. Now here I'm being very careful because the black line that I just drew is still a bit on the wet side. And then as it dries, I can be a little bit more aggressive. Alright, here we are back to complete the steam. I'm using Acrylic Cute Stencil, and I'm putting another layer of texture paste over the original steam layer that was put down earlier. This is just a stencil full of curlicues, and I'm just matching the stencil up to my idea of what the steam should look like. It's very difficult to get this exactly where we want it, so I'll just put it down and then remove and clean up any of the texture paste that is in the wrong location. As you can see, the label has been completed and is ready for an initial. We're going to set this aside and let all of this dry, and I hope you'll join me in part 3 as we finish up this canvas. See you soon.